Hello, my name is Dr. Nick Bowman. I'm an associate professor in the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech University. And I'm going to present shortly today on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Justin Keene, who is a newly minted associate professor in the College of Media and Communication, and Cristina Jimenez Najera, who is one of our doctoral students who helped us with the organization and project management of this paper. This is a very basic project trying to understand the relationship between flow states and how people perceive the rewards and efforts and demand of interactive media. And very quickly down below, you can see our Twitter handles, the Communication Science and Biology interest group, which we want to thank for inviting us to present, our open science badges, as well as our QR code where we share our data and our materials for this project. So we'd love to engage you on Twitter and through the ICA channels afterwards. The project, as I said, had a very basic focus. How are perceived demands of interactive technology related to flow experiences while consuming and engaging those technologies? Well, let's define those ideas, right? So we know that video games and other interactive media require user engagement. In fact, what makes games so much fun is that you get to have control relatively over the form and the content of what's on screen. But of course, that invitation to engage the content is also a demand of you as the player, as the user. You've got to make sense of and solve and understand the content. There are some cognitive demands involved. There are going to be some immediately valenced reactions you have to that content, whether it's the game, the narrative, other bits and pieces, and there's going to be emotional demands there. There are the physical demands where you've got to input things into the system. You've got to push buttons or maybe move your entire body in order to make things happen on that screen. And then, of course, there's the social efforts and demands that come with both in-game and in-narrative characters and people you form relationships with, but also real humans, whether they're physically located or digitally located. And you've got to balance out and make sense of those relationships. And generally speaking, those things probably have to operate at varying amounts in order for the player to really enjoy the experience, right? If you had to do all four of those things in a very high level, we have a limited capacity to process that information, and we may not enjoy it as much. And we may focus on some things over other things, and we'll talk about that. We know, for example, in video games, when challenges and skills are balanced, when the challenge of the system balances with the skills of the player, there's this intrinsically motivating flow state that takes place where I enjoy the experience. It's self-motivating. I may even lose a sense of awareness and a sense of time. Whereas if the game is too simple and my skills outweigh the challenges, I'm quite bored. And if the challenges far exceed my skills, I'm quite frustrated. And simply stated, there's a lot of research on flow states, but there's not nearly as much research on these perceptions and these demands. And we wanted to do a very simple proof of concept that flow states should result in different patterns of perceived demand. We would expect cognitive demands to be, kind of moderate in a state of flow, frustration being too much cognitive demand and boredom being too little. We might expect, for example, exertional demand, how much you have to move your body and really exert your resources physically, would be really high in a frustration condition and really low in a boredom condition and kind of moderate in a flow condition. And as for controller demands, this idea that you can perceive the device in your hands as demanding, we might actually expect the lowest scores in a flow condition when you're actually engaged in the process and you're not paying much attention to the controller. Whereas in both frustration and boredom, you might see the demands as higher because you're aware the controller is maybe disrupting your experience and otherwise serving as a barrier. Okay, and we'll test all three of these at the start of our proof of concept. Our study used Richard Huskey's asteroid impact. I'll leave you to the GitHub on screen to get the specific details of that game, although there's an animation here in front of us. The general idea with this game is that you control a spaceship, and you use the mouse to move the spaceship away from the asteroid and collect different items. And that's the primary task. And the secondary task of the game there are these occasional blips on screen. And when the screen blips, you hit the keyboard and we log your reaction times. And this game is not a very fancy AAA game, but the reason we used it is because of its internal validity. We know this game can reliably induce boredom and flow and frustration states. In particular, the boredom state uses a dynamic difficulty adjuster that takes the player feedback and constantly adjusts the game for the player. We had 123 people in our study with moderate gaming experience, modern gaming skill. They played all conditions of the game randomized, one of each, and then they took the questionnaires afterwards, and that's what you see on screen. And again, all these details are in the GitHub as well as our OSF space following the QR code in the bottom left corner. Well, we induced flow okay, right? I kind of wish the flow states would have been a little stronger, but for self-reports of flow, frustration was pretty easy to induce. These were quite low scores, but it turns out it's kind of hard to make people bored, especially in a relatively short study, and flow and boredom elicited similar levels of self-reported flow. And by reaction times to that secondary task, we saw that the boredom folks were much quicker, which we'd expect, but the frustration and flow folks didn't differ all that much, although we think we have a reason for this in our study. In fact, looking at those reaction times, it gets kind of cool. So within the conditions, we know that reaction times vary over time, as you'd expect, but the way they vary is so different. So for the bored folks, they start off very quick. They almost seem to lose interest or maybe fatigue a little bit, and their scores get higher, and then they correct. For the flow people, remember that the game adjusts dynamically. We do see initially quick reactions. They slow down a little bit, and then folks probably learn the adjustment and speed up. For the frustration condition, this is great. They start off very slow, very, very slow. But as the study goes on and as the game goes on, they get very quick, very fast, and it follows almost a linear function. So it's like linear for frustration, quadratic for flow, and cubic for boredom. And we think this one here says a lot about what they saw as rewarding. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. So for cognitive demand, sure, we support our prediction. Cognitive demand scores were low for bored people. They were middling for people in the flow condition. They were high in the frustration condition. The different lines represent the different orders. There were no order effects. And over here, you see the average means across those different conditions. And we see the exact same pattern with exertion, okay? We're the least exerting in the boredom condition. We exert a moderate amount in the flow condition. We exert much more in the frustration condition, and those findings follow this linear pattern. Controller demand gets weird. We actually found that people in the boredom condition saw the controller as highly demanding. But we saw people in the frustration condition, they saw the controller as the least demanding. And that didn't make any sense. So these first two patterns we expected, but we expected it to go here. And it did not, it dropped. The controller was seen as more natural and more intuitive as the players shifted towards frustration. And we think we have a reason. If you go back to that reaction time graph, people got better as the study went on. What we think's going on here is that players essentially dumped the primary task of taking the spaceship and avoiding the asteroids. They realized they couldn't do it. It's way too hard. They got the spaceship out of the way so asteroids wouldn't hit it. And instead, they put all of their focus on the secondary task, the reaction time, which is very simple. Light blinks, hit spacebar. Light blinks, hit spacebar. They essentially had to cope with the demands of this game, the cognitive and exertional demands. And one of the ways they coped with that is by essentially playing the game under their own rules and playing it very differently. And we think that says a lot about how players manage demands when they still want to enjoy or engage in experience. Here, they shifted towards the secondary task, made it the primary task, and that became rewarding. So, but flow states are demanding, and they're moderately demanding. But when you're frustrated and you have the ability to shift focus, we saw people shifting focus towards the one thing they could control. They shifted towards the simplest action with the lowest controller demand as a way to cope with the high cognitive demands, and they compensated this way. We have a large team who works with us. Here are some of their faces on screen, and we hope to reach out to everybody. Importantly, we'd love to talk to all of you in greater detail about these findings. Thank you very much for your time.